Navigating Misjudgment, a practical framework for better board performance. We all know that biases exist. And in the aftermath of corporate failure, there is talk about a board's misjudgment. We therefore want to draw attention to decision-making errors that are crucial to high-stake decision-makers in all types of boards. Based on the concept of bias, deaf spots, and tone-deaf leadership, I talk with my podcast partner about a framework of misjudgment traps that are acting as warning flags. We also discuss solutions to sources of mental misinformation. I'm Dr. Sabine Dembkowski, founder and managing partner of Better Boards. In this episode, my guest is Nuala Walsh. She's non-executive director, chair and CEO of MindEquity, where she advises on reputation, culture, and strategy. She's also chair of various organizations like Innocence Project London, iNED at British and Irish Lions, president of Harvard Club Ireland, deputy chair of the FA Inclusion Advisory Board, and vice chair at UN Women UK. Formerly, she was a chief marketing officer in various financial services organizations, and she's adjunct professor of behavioral science at Trinity College. Nuala, thank you so much for contributing to the Better Boards podcast series.
Thank you very much, Sabine. It's great to be here.
So I heard you speak. We were together at the conference, and I know that you served on various sports, human rights, and business boards. You have seen the good, the bad, the ugly. What have you seen that really leads to misjudgment of boards?
It's a great question, Sabine. I think the most important determinant of judgment at board level is really the context in which they decide. It's a combination of their mindset as well as the environment, because as you well know, our perspective is bounded by the experience, the background, and the context in which people make the decisions. And that's actually an idea that goes back decades, called bounded rationality. But the problem for boards today is that the noisy world we live in is making it much harder for them to hear what really matters. And that's due to a combination of data overload, disinformation, and distraction. And if you then consider pace and speed and inattention, it really is a toxic mix for board decision-making and judgment. And because of this decision ecosystem, even the smartest boards, I think, are more at risk of tuning out really what matters, the data that matters, the voices that matters, and in many cases, unfortunately, they're just rushing to misjudgment.
I mean, I can absolutely relate to all of this when we observe boards as part of a board evaluation. That is exactly what we are seeing. So let's jump in what boards can really do, but let's explore a little bit before. I know that in your book, you were talking about deaf spots or the inability to hear what really matters. What makes it so hard for directors to really listen to presenters and one another during a board meeting?
Yeah, and if I can just step back maybe a little with that, I think the problem is that people don't spend enough time understanding the impact of the environment on human behavior. So if you even step outside of the boardroom, and it's quite ironic because their reputation and performance depends on it. So I argue really that the biggest risk is this decision risk, and decision risk is triggered by this tendency to tune out what really matters. And as a result, board members, it's not just board members, we hear less, we misjudge more. And in a board meeting, under pressure, under situations of crisis, conflict, uncertainty, people rely on what they see, not necessarily what they hear. So they might miss these signals, messages, data reports, anything that's uncomfortable and that they don't want to hear. But as you well know, not everything you hear is valuable and not everything valuable is heard, especially at the board meeting. And the smartest thing that a board director or chair can know is who to listen to and who not to listen to, especially when they hold power, because so many people depend on their decisions. And I think this is underappreciated in many cases. So the point about deaf spots is really that people are very familiar with, of course, the concept of blind spots, but deaf spots are when we tune out what really matters and we just don't really hear enough of that. So, and for an example of how you might do that, you might cherry pick data to support a preconceived view. So if the board is planning a merger, they only listen to a particular view. They take information presented at face value, and that happens all the time, whether it's to suit their agenda or just to look good. So there are many examples where this happens. And as a result, organizations are defrauded, by, I think it's 5% of revenues every year because of this tone deaf leadership. And they tune out these voices and these things that really matter. In many ways, people just hear themselves through ego bias or people who look like them as opposed to, the discerning message. So this whole concept of deaf spots is quite different. And I think it really reflects all of the scandals that we hear, the misjudgments by boards.
Yeah.
And in many cases, it's just a classic case of deaf ear syndrome, if you like.
I think listeners, and we are all familiar with the echo chambers that we are all in these days by listening to certain social media channels that we are familiar with, that we like, and tuning out all the other social media channels that might give us different information. So what can boards really do to prevent this? Or what can an individual director who hears about this and who says, I recognize this, what can he, she, or do about it?
Well, I think the first thing is to actually even recognize that it's happening. And the problem is in many cases that people don't recognize it. There is an overconfidence in many boards, as you're probably well aware of. And, several biases underpin this. So boards might overestimate their ability to make accurate judgments. So in the first place, even understanding that they have such a thing called the illusion of validity. So they cling to their initial assessments when they're presented with contradictory budgetary or regulatory evidence, or they underestimate the investment risks. So we thought in Yahoo had, 53 acquisitions, 52 of those failed. We saw it in Theranos. So in order to know how to get it right, you actually need to understand why people get it wrong. So it's very easy for us, Sabine, to just jump to, well, here are the 3 things you need to do to get it right. And we can do that, and it's certainly a start. But I really do think that the problem is that people don't go back. People don't go back and analyse what actually happened. And so even if you take an example like Theranos, the blood testing technology, and you remember, of course, former CEO Elizabeth Holmes. The problem at the board was that most people took her claims at face value. A very confident messenger, told a really compelling story. And even when the consultants and the whistleblowers raised red flags, people at the board, very decorated dignitaries, people with considerable experience, but not in her field, tuned out the truth. So is it a question at that board, were they not comfortable raising the concerns? Was it just easier to turn a deaf ear? Was it wishful thinking? Did they just hear what they wanted to hear? Was it easy because it was all making money and they were part of the success story? So I think analysing this motivated reasoning really, really matters. What can you do differently? And there are lessons from boards of all types. So, and organisations can deny this accountability. Sometimes it's self-preservation. Sometimes it's naivety. Sometimes it's this noisy world, as we talked about earlier. I mean, so even if you consider a university board, and I think of the Jerry Sandusky case in the US, the abuse of coaches, the Penn State board remained really confident in their governance, and they saw no reason to distrust the reports about these constant allegations. So they're quoted as saying that they just felt no need to ask more questions. So this basic assumption of ask questions, even if you think you know the answer, going to that second level order of questioning, interrogating the data, reinterpreting what you hear is the first start. And as we say, there are many examples of this tone deaf board judgment, but the first step is to at least appreciate that you are vulnerable to error, and that there is a possibility of potential failure if people do constantly tune out. And HSBC was fined 72 million for just failing to protect their customers from the possibility of a collapse. And I think as we started, people tune out not for ill intent, but because they're busy, they're overwhelmed, they've got too much data, sometimes they have too little data. But in many cases, it's not just the environment, it's a combination of how the environment affects how people think, whether it's short-term thinking or this rush to judgment. So there are many, many different aspects that we can certainly touch on that boards can look at. But the early warning signs are usually there.
Let's talk a bit about these early warning signs, maybe the most common early warning signs that should trigger greater awareness and spark the idea, let's look at this closer, let's stop and pause and let's think how we can do it better. Tell us a little bit more about these early warning signs.
Yeah, and I think you can look at any board that you sit on, and I think you will probably notice it's the behaviours of the board. And boards like to talk about culture, but the culture of the actual board, I think, is very interesting as well. And in many cases, that doesn't hold itself up to scrutiny. So there are a couple of warning signs, and I would point to maybe 5 or 6. I think the first one is obvious. Maybe the boards that reward short-term results under crisis, under resource scarcity. I mean, that has to be a warning flag. But it's not just the short-term results. It's also a board that rewards short-term decision-making. So there's a Harvard study that shows that if a CEO makes quick decisions, confident decisions, that they are 12 times more likely to be promoted than anybody else. Well, they're promoted to CEOs. And that's a huge statement. And it's not just somebody getting to CEO level. So 12 times more likely rather than the person who is seen to deliberate or let's take our time because we know that the markets demand, quick performance and quick turnaround and everything else. So this high pressure, instant reward, instant results environment is the first clue. And if the board itself is doing that and not planning long term, of course they'll talk long term. Every board talks about long term, but of course, how many of them do it? So particularly if you're a public listed board. So the first one is that short termism. The second one is that they don't invest in themselves. And, when you are successful, you're actually more vulnerable to this decision-making risk than others. So everybody has it, but because the consequences are so much greater. You hold a board position, it's an enormous seat of power. And people's lives really do depend on you getting it right. And I think it's a moral responsibility, if nothing else. But how many boards, Sabine, do you know that actually invest? It's not anti-bias education. It's understanding how the mind works and where they are. And that's why I have in the book, I have 75 different biases wrapped up into 10 different misjudgment traps. And we could talk about that later. But if you don't even go that level to understand, and don't just say, we understand bias. Well, do you understand bias? Do you understand that there are 200 different biases? I'm quite sure most people don't, unless you've studied it to some extent. But boards don't teach that. Classrooms don't teach any of that. When you do that, you gain greater power, influence, and your judgment improves. So the next one then that I probably look at is that they don't monitor it. So even a savvy board that does get this whole world of understanding, and every business problem has a behavioural problem at its cause. And if the board doesn't introduce this in its own decision-making environment and monitor it, you've absolutely no hope of overcoming this. The other trigger for me is a warning sign is about wanting more data. So boards obsess about data. And you've probably found this, Sabine, in all of your evaluations.
No, absolutely. And that boards seek an easy way out also with evaluations. Hey, how short can it be? Oh, we don't want that directors spend too long on answering a questionnaire. And the other thing is, a lot of times these behavioral issues are not really part of traditional board evaluations, which makes it even harder. And the feedback loops for individual directors are also very often missing, which we have addressed in our approach. But you just highlight how essential it is really for good decision making.
It's absolutely critical, Sabine. And a danger is this obsession with more data. And there are lots of studies that show, and that can be an excuse. If you're not sure, nobody admits indecision, particularly if you're on a board and you're being very well paid. But you might be indecisive, and the whole board might be indecisive. But then ego comes into play. Who's going to admit that publicly? Absolutely. Sometimes you might, but you certainly won't do it repeatedly. So sometimes a clue is if the people constantly want more and more data. At some point, you don't need more data. And there's a fantastic study that shows that having and they counted 83, and this is in forecasting, 83 pieces of data make no greater accuracy than 5 pieces of data. So more is not better. Is basically that is a very good point, because an easy way out that I observed so many times. When the boards fawn over the CEO, or there is too tight a relationship with the chair and the CEO. Neither of those situations are good. So for me, there are plenty of triggers. I mean, it could be a very long list of triggers, but maybe there are some of the more obvious ones, or a consensus. I sit on a consensus board, and I remember being interviewed for this board, and they prided themselves on saying, well, we always agree, and, we like to reach consensus. We must have consensus before we reach conclusion. And I thought, well, isn't that automatic groupthink? So this conflict avoidance, this desire for harmony, can negate the need for critical questions. And ironically, I'm now sitting on the board, and we had our first situation where I decided to, I didn't agree with something. And I'm thinking, you're never going to get consensus because I'm never going to actually say I agree on this particular topic. So you take it on board. Now you get outvoted is what happens there. So there was a very contentious topic. I was very pleased that somebody else agreed with me on this issue. So I wasn't on my own, but I didn't mind doing it. Because at the end of the day, you're paid to give your opinion on a board. I mean, why are you there if you're not actually giving your opinion? So for me, a major warning sign of potential misjudgment is too much board consensus and groupthink.
I would like to come back to one point, because I've observed it so many times, is if a board isn't able to make a decision, the easiest way out is always to ask the presenter or the CEO or the CFO for more information.
So, Sabine, there are a number of the early warning signs, and there are quite a few, and we could be here for a long time talking about them. But I think that these form part of the traps, and I've identified quite a few traps that we can talk about, which really boards should be aware of in a very simple way to help them avoid making these misjudgment calls.
Yeah, come on then. Tell us something about these traps.
Okay, great. I think maybe even just to define them, I've identified 10 factors that bias the boardroom perspective. And I've grouped 75 different biases. As we said, that there are 200 biases, but I've grouped them into 10 traps. And they form the mnemonic perimeters. And the word is deliberately chosen because, of course, perimeters suggests narrow thinking. And I'll just list them out so that you get a better handle of them. It's power, ego, risk, identity, memory, ethics, time, emotion, relationships, and stories. And these are all situations that cloud people's judgment. So each is a source of misinformation. So even if I take at a very high level the power-based traps, so there are 6 or 7 different biases that equate to the power-based traps. And we know that boards and companies pursue power really narrowly, but that clouds judgment. So you can only need to think of Volkswagen or Boeing or FTX, or you might think about the illusion of invulnerability. You don't think you'll be fired, or you don't think there will be misconduct in your organization. And this was seen in everything from the opioid crisis to the Sacklers and McKinsey, where people are chasing power. You can see too much deferential, and you will see this in your board evaluations, deference to the chair, even when their decisions might be flawed. So that's authority bias, or you might have what they call a country club board, which is that non-confrontational rubber stamping board that I talked about a moment ago, all reinforced by the halo effect. And this was very evident with WeWork. Adam Newman, who you may remember, he was a very engaging personality, but his personality sort of overtook the venture capitalist judgment and the boards that he sat on. And some of the board members afterwards, after its failure, talk about that they just made bonkers decisions, using their phrase, because his personality was so overwhelming. And you have this halo effect. So when people are chasing power, there are a number of different biases that come into play. And we could be here for a long time talking about all of them, which is why I gave a chapter to each of those power-based, each of those traps, because there are so many, and there are, really excellent examples that go from medicine, business, law, the courts, space, you name it, every single industry. There are examples of power-based traps, ego-based traps, memory-based traps, as in, for example, memory-based traps. I'll just give you 1 minute on that. This is really evident in things like, acquisitions. So RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland, once upon a time pursued a trophy acquisition of ABN AMRO, and I think it was costing 49 million. But the problem with that was that they'd already completed 26 acquisitions. So a complacent board just predicted, this will be another success. And it was only in hindsight that the chairman, Philip Hampton, told shareholders, well, with the benefit of hindsight, it can now be seen as the wrong price, the wrong way to pay at the wrong time. It was the wrong deal. And they posted a £28 billion loss, and the government had to bail them out. And this was a combination of 4, 5, 6 different biases, Sabine. It wasn't just power. It was about identity. It was about the ego of the CEO. He wanted to leave a legacy. So all of these traps combine for misjudgment. So there's what they call a force multiplier effect. It's not just one. And this is repeated over and over again. And I argue that boards need to know their judgment risk profile. You can actually use a diagnostic with clients in the same way that you do, which is to track the level of vulnerability that a board has or an organization has. And that's what I do with companies now. I track their risk profile from a judgment perspective, but specifically around those 10 misjudgment traps, because we're all subject to all of them in any situation.
I look at the watch, just 30 seconds on the ego trap. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, the ego one is, of course, probably everyone's favourite. I love the phrase, the peacock cares about who's right, not what's right. And ego, they say, is the most dangerous 3-letter word. So the ego-based traps, it happens when boards overestimate their ability to make judgments. So it is about this illusion of validity of information. You assume the information in front of you is valid, and it often isn't. You've rushed to judgment, you're busy, you're distracted, your phone is on, and they underestimate these risks. So overconfidence is a huge one, of course. Belief bias. Belief bias is very good when you want to be progressive and innovative. So, of course, there's a role for belief bias, but this is a spectrum, and it's a spectrum of overconfidence and underconfidence. Too much belief bias, too little belief bias. So either can be a problem, because you have boards, of course, that are stuck in the past and won't change. And you have all of these status quo, these temporal biases that come into play. So understanding how ego-based bias merges with your risk appetite, with your desire for identity and to leave a legacy, with what emotion you're talking about. Is it denial? Is it wishful thinking? Which ones come into play? What stories, what narratives you believe you're being told, what narratives you tell yourself. It's really, really interesting, because all of these combine. And to be honest, if you can analyse any board failure, so, it's my hobby to analyse these. I look at the British Post Office example. I look at the Ocean Gate, the CEO who really had a lot of belief bias, that his vessel was going to reach the Titanic and the submersible, and he rejected the voice of 38 different experts. So in that case, there are many, many different examples.
Nuala, we can talk for hours, but we need to watch a little bit the time. Give us some practical tips. I know that there are no easy ways out for boards, but give our listeners some, to the point, some tips how they can really avoid bad decision making.
Okay, great. I think make time to revisit your intuition. Too often we rely on our intuition. When you recheck your intuition, studies have shown that you improve your accuracy from 10% to 40%. It's that simple. I think the answer is X. Go off and fact check it, and the difference will go between 10% and 40%. The second thing that I would suggest is to be very intentional about reinterpretation. Reinterpret what you hear, what you don't hear. You can't trust all you hear is the fundamental message. Question assumptions, ask questions, question answers, and seek clarification. Because what happens is when you tune out, others tune you out. And others can be shareholders, customers, investors. So bear in mind, the only thing that you remember is to question answers and ask more questions, because otherwise you are at this risk of tuning out the wrong voices at the wrong time. And it is a moral responsibility. So in the book, of course, there are 18 different things that people can do. We will not talk about them now, but there are 18 science-based tips and techniques that people can use as a tool. But a checklist is a very good start.
Great. Now we have to come to an end. What are the 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast episode?
Okay, I think the first one is your decisions really matter more than you think. You hold power. You have responsibility beyond what you might consciously think about. So don't overweight what's logical with the psychological. Don't forget to consider the human mind, the human element in all of the decisions. The second one is that nobody is immune. It doesn't matter if you sit on a board. It doesn't matter what level you are at or other people are at. Nobody is immune from these misjudgment traps. So evaluate your board mindset regularly. Teach, educate, update all the time. Because as I said earlier, the more successful you are, the more vulnerable you are, and the more vulnerable other people are to your mistakes. And the third one, I think, is really, I just go back to that point of not everything you hear is valuable and not everything valuable is heard. Listen differently, tune in differently to what you hear, and don't take things at face value, because the smartest thing you can know is who to listen to and who not. And I think if you remember those 3 points at least, I think you have a far greater likelihood of standing out rather than losing out as a board.
Fantastic. Nuala, thank you so much. Very rich, very lots of information in this episode. Thank you so much for contributing to the BetterBots podcast series.
Thank you very much, Sabine.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the BetterBots podcast series. Please do get in touch if you have any questions, if you have a suggestion for a future episode in the BetterBots podcast series, or if you would like to learn about our board effectiveness solutions. There are real people behind this episode, so this one is not AI generated. We look forward to hearing from you.